Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Bruce Riedel on the Iranian nuclear program. Hello and welcome to the initial installment of the third season of the Inside the Issues video podcast series. I'm David Welch, your host, the Balsillie School's Chair of Global Security and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I'm pleased to welcome here into the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation a noted expert on some aspect of international politics or global governance. And today, to kick off our next season, I'm very happy to welcome Bruce Riedel, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and for 30 years an analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency and an advisor to 4 different presidents. Noted expert, particularly on the Middle and the Near East. And Bruce, we're very happy to have you here. Very timely, your visit to Waterloo, because among the most pressing items in the headlines these days is Iran and the possibility that there may be a war between either Israel and Iran or Israel and the United States and Iran in the not too distant future. So appreciate having your insights on this, both your deep historical insights and your current insights. And perhaps you might start by giving us a sense of why it is that Iran is apparently in search of a nuclear capability and why it's so resistant to the global pressure to keep that under limits.
Certainly. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here today with you. Iran is a country that feels isolated, feels under siege. This is a country which has been the target now, it's an open secret, of cyber warfare. Iranian nuclear scientists are being assassinated on the streets of Iran. There is a covert war going on between Iran, the United States, and Israel. Iran is responding. Many would argue Iran started the covert war back in 1979 when it took American diplomats hostage. The Iranians see themselves living in a very dangerous part of the world. They are surrounded on all corners by countries which they believe are hostile and which many have nuclear weapons. Pakistan, India to the east, Russia to the north, Israel to the west, and America in the Persian Gulf to the south. Now, Iran has created many of these enemies, but the reality is even if it's your fault that you created enemies, you have them. And Iranian national security leaders, I think, increasingly feel that the only way Iran will ever be secure is if it has its own nuclear deterrent. They remember that their neighbor to the east, Afghanistan, and their neighbor to the west, Iraq, have both been invaded or liberated, depending upon your point of view, by the United States in the last decade. Neither of those wars would have happened had Iraq or Afghanistan had nuclear weapons, and that's a message, that's a lesson the Iranians unfortunately have drawn from recent history.
But Afghanistan was invaded because it was host to al-Qaeda, and Iraq was invaded officially because it was seeking nuclear weapons. So Iran doesn't host al-Qaeda.
Right.
In fact, al-Qaeda is quite antagonistic to Iran.
Absolutely.
And if it's going to be invaded, it might be invaded precisely because it's seeking nuclear weapons. So
Right.
if you're sitting in Tehran and you're trying to decide what serves my national security interests best, is it obvious that having a nuclear capability is a solution to a problem or a problem in and of itself?
My guess, and this is just a guess, but it's based on a lot of time studying this Iranian revolutionary regime, is the degree of ambiguity is probably what they'd really like to have. The perception that they have a bomb in the basement without having actually tested it or taken the step of moving across the threshold. That's the kind of ambiguity about your nuclear program, which will tend to deter anyone from coming after you, but not necessarily get you into the jailhouse of having broken the non-proliferation regime and actually be a declared violator of international agreements. And in some ways, that's exactly the position the Iranians are moving themselves into. Everyone knows they're enriching more and more uranium. Everyone knows they have missiles which could be used to deliver a nuclear weapon. And at a certain point, everyone would agree, or most experts would agree, that in 5 years, probably less, they'll have that capability, and therefore they'll have the bomb in the basement deterrent. I suspect that's where the Iranians would like to end up. Now, for the United States, and especially for Israel, that may be, however, a step too far.
Now, in the last 50 years, Iran's only been invaded once, and that was by Iraq. Iraq didn't do very well in that. Iran more or less demonstrated that it's a pretty tough place to invade. And you don't think they would take some comfort in the historical record of their own resistance to foreign interference, that in and of itself wouldn't be an adequate deterrent?
You're absolutely right that the Iran-Iraq War is the formative experience of the generation which leads Iran today. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, Ahmadinejad, all of these people, their life's worldview was formed in those 8 years of war against Iraq. Somewhere around 250,000 Iranians lost their lives. Another 500,000, probably more like 750,000, were wounded. It's scarred in their memory. Yes, they ended up repelling the Iraqis, but the cost was enormous. And they don't want to repeat that. They don't want another war like that. They want to be in a position, just like many countries around the world, where they feel confident that they have the ultimate deterrent. And unfortunately, nuclear weapons have become the badge of the ultimate deterrent. That if you have a nuclear bomb, even if you're a crazy, maniacal state like North Korea that can't feed its own people, you have the get out of jail safety pass.
Now, you've described the Iranian motivation as primarily defensive in seeking a nuclear capability. The neighboring countries, many of them anyway, think it must be an offensive rationale. And certainly the Gulf states worried about the increased influence of Iranian promotion of Shia Islam. Saudi Arabia is very worried. Israel, of course, takes Ahmadinejad's statements at face value that he'd like to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Two questions there. One is there any reason seriously to think that Iran might have local hegemonic or expansionist ambitions? And secondly, if they don't, why does he say things like that?
Right. Well, 4,000 years of Persian history would argue, yes, they have hegemonic designs. Whether they do or not, memories in the Middle East are long. And Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, Jews in Palestine, remember when Persian armies did come and conquer them. Now, it may have been thousands of years ago, but that legacy is there. And this regime, over the course of its 30-plus years in office, has been a dangerous regime. It sponsored violence and extremism. It sponsored terrorism. It is the patron of the Hezbollah terrorist organization. Its track record makes everyone understandably very, very nervous. And an Iran with nuclear weapons may acquire them for defensive purposes, but once a country gets nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons capability, the historical track record is they get pretty cocky and pretty self-assured. And they're much more willing to push their neighbors around, particularly their neighbors who don't have nuclear weapons, small countries like the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain. So it's understandable. There's a lot of concern in the region about what will a nuclear Iran look like. No one wants that outcome, I think, other than the Iranians, and it's understandable. But I think at the same time, much as we would prefer not to have an Iran with nuclear weapons, we also ought to recognize one other fact. There's nothing in the 30-plus years of Iran's history as an Islamic republic that suggests it's a suicidal state, that it's bent on using nuclear weapons the moment it gets them for some goal. Iran talks a lot about wiping Israel off the map, but its history shows it's more careful and pragmatic in the use of force and not likely to engage in a suicidal maneuver because, after all, Israel's a nuclear weapon state too.
Very good. We'll be back in a moment with Bruce Riedel. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Israel, very worried about Iran and a nuclear weapon, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is apparently an enthusiast for the option of attacking Iran to make sure that it doesn't get a nuclear weapon, preferably at all, but most people would say the best Israel could do is delay the weaponization of an Iranian capability. Several questions arise here. One is Bibi bluffing? Does he really want to attack Iran? And if so, why? And if not, why would he be bluffing? And secondly, what do you make of the fascinating debate in Israel where very senior people in the intelligence community and the armed forces are directly contradicting their own prime minister on the advisability of attacking Iran?
Well, first, Israel understandably feels threatened by Iran. The Iranian leadership says it wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. The Iranian leadership supports Hezbollah. Hezbollah today has in Lebanon, according to the Israelis, 70 to 80,000 missiles and rockets targeted on northern Israel. So there is a threat. It's understandable in that environment that Israelis are worried about where this situation is going and what an Iran with nuclear weapons would look like. Whether the Prime Minister is bluffing or not, he's certainly staked out a pretty strong position. He has said publicly on more than one occasion that the analogy to the current situation is Europe in 1938 with the rise of Nazi Germany. Now, if you're an Israeli Prime Minister and you're saying that it's 1938 and we're facing an imminent threat and you're not going to do anything about it, you may be bluffing, but you've also boxed yourself into a corner. There's not a lot of room left for you to maneuver. And I think that's where this debate begins. I think senior Israeli intelligence, security, and military officials are looking at that and saying, Mr. Prime Minister, you're boxing us into a corner. The use of force is going to have enormous consequences. And most important of all, what's our plan for the day after the use of force? What do we do when the international consensus against Iran now fragments and a large part of the world says, Israel, you're the aggressor. You started this. What's your plan for that? I think it's healthy. I wish we had as vibrant a debate in the United States about Iran as we're seeing today in Israel about Iran.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked earlier about some of the simulation exercises you've been involved with at Brookings and perhaps even elsewhere. One way people try to get their minds around the what happens after question is they do a simulation game in effect. Right. Basically seeing how people in roles will react to various moves and counter moves. Tell us a bit about what happens in these games. Whenever you have a simulation of, say, an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, what happens? Is there any outcome
right,
which redounds to Israel's national interest or to the interest of the broader stability of the region?
Well, in one of our exercises at the Brookings Institution, we gave Israel the perfect first strike. They lost nothing, and they totally took out all of the targets they wanted to. A fantasy first strike, if you like. The Iranian response was to fire missiles into Israel and to push Hezbollah into firing this huge arsenal of rockets and missiles into northern Israel. That had several impacts. First of all, oil prices spiked like crazy. Whether there was a risk of oil coming off the market or not, the psychological effect was enormous. Secondly, northern Israel basically becomes an area that has to be evacuated. And that means the Israeli economy comes to a halt. And the United States is dragged in. There's no way we can't be dragged in. From the Iranian standpoint, an Israeli strike on Iran is made in America. They're American-made F-16s, American-made F-15s, they're American-made munitions, they're flying with pilots trained in the United States. The Iranians are not going to see a whole lot of difference. So we get dragged in as well.
Is it that the Iranians are attacking Americans in this exercise?
In most experts' judgment, including my own, the Iranians will retaliate not only against Israel, but against American targets as well. And there's a target-rich environment of American targets, not the least of which, of course, is Obama's war next door to Iran in Afghanistan, where the Iranians could easily make what is already a very, very difficult conflict even more precarious for the United States. But there's also American targets throughout the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, Turkey. Israel is a relatively hard target to go after. The United States is a very easy target to go after.
And in these exercises, do you continue them long enough to try to determine whether the United States is likely to respond aggressively towards Iran? Do these end up in a very large-scale war?
Absolutely. It becomes a regional war, basically from the Mediterranean to the Khyber Pass. Not all as intense, but a regional conflict. And if you look at the debate in Israel today, you will see people like Ephraim Halevi, the former head of the Mossad, or Yuval Dishkin, the former head of the Internal Service, all saying this, that what starts off as a small conflict can rapidly become a regional conflict with unintended developments and whose outcome becomes almost impossible to predict.
So you can't even tell who would win.
You can't know ahead of time. I mean, that's the lesson of the last two wars America has gone into, Iraq and Afghanistan. It may look easy going in, it's always going to be a lot more complicated once you're there.
That's right. We'll be back in a moment with Bruce Riedel. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So some of what's going on may have something to do with the fact that the United States is going to elect a president in early November. How does that electoral politics factor into the politics both in Israel, in the United States, possibly even in Tehran?
Sure. This American election, like most elections in democratic countries, is more about internal affairs and, as always, more about the economy than anything else. Foreign affairs barely registered in the two-party conventions, with one exception, Iran. Iran is a hot button in American politics. It has been since 1979, and it's intimately related to the issue of Israel and your support for Israel. It's no secret that President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu don't get along very well together. They have substantive differences, and anyone who's ever watched video of the two of men together can tell they just don't get along very well. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu would much prefer that the Republican challenger, Governor Romney, be the next president of the United States. But he's also smart enough to know that interfering in the domestic affairs of the United States is a red line that no Israeli government has ever crossed. The American election adds a sense of urgency over the course of the next 2 months and less. Will something happen between now and then because everyone will feel they want to influence the outcome of that election? Let's all hope not. I would hope that we would have a rational and serious debate about what should we do with Iran. We'd all like to see sanctions and diplomacy convince the Iranians to stop the time on their nuclear program, but they may not. And we need to have a plan B. And that plan B needs to be really thoroughly debated, thought about, and talked about, not in sound bites, but in a serious discussion.
Now, Romney talks about Iran differently than the president does, and he does come across as much more hawkish. But there are people who say that one should take what Romney says on the campaign trail with a grain of salt because he's the ultimate pragmatist and that he will tack left, right, toward the center depending on the need. And that it's very hard to know in advance what his Iranian policy might look like. Do you have a sense of how we could predict that? Would he be as hawkish, do you think, as he sounds like he would be if he were elected?
All candidates become transformed in that period between election and inauguration, and they start receiving briefings from the CIA and the Pentagon about the costs and the dangers of various options. But they also can't escape their past. If you run on a certain platform, it's possible to wiggle out of what you said, but it's not always easy, particularly if you've gotten campaign donations in the millions and millions of dollars from people who expect that you're going to live up to what you promised them, not only in public, but what you promised them in private, in those fundraising dinners and lunches and breakfasts you went to. So I think that, yes, one shouldn't assume that Governor Romney is going to be on autopilot. I think he's a smart man. I think he will obviously have to adjust to hearing what's going on when he actually has the responsibility of power. But he also inherits a legacy of what he's promised in this campaign. And he's said on more than one occasion that President Obama's greatest failure as president has been to halt Iran's nuclear program. He's placed the bar for himself there pretty high.
Mm-hmm. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu would love to see any American president draw red lines, and beyond which, if Iran crosses them, there will be war, there will be military action. What exactly are these red lines that we keep reading about? What would they be concretely, in your view? And is it ever a good idea to draw red lines like this?
The red line will probably be something about the degree of enrichment that Iran will be permitted to carry out. different experts will draw it at different points. I think President Obama and his national security team are understandably reluctant to lock themselves into a situation in which the decision to go to war no longer is an American decision. It becomes an Iranian decision. And that's the danger with red lines. You lose the power to decide whether or not you're going to use force. The decision to use force, to send young men and women to die for their country, is the most important decision any American president, any Canadian prime minister, any Israeli prime minister has to make. And you should keep that decision in your hands and not give it to the enemy to make.
Mm. Now, you said in your excellent CG Signature Series lecture recently that you thought containment has been the de facto policy of Iran for a long time, and that it's worked fairly well, and that there's no reason to think containment couldn't work even if Iran did develop a nuclear capability. You also mentioned that that's a politically unpopular thing for any president to say, but is there any problem with containing even a nuclear Iran?
You know, the United States has successfully used a containment and deterrence policy to keep Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, and many other bad actors from using nuclear weapons. It's a difficult and frustrating policy to pursue because by definition there's no light at the end of the tunnel. It can go on for a long, long time. There's nothing in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran, however, that suggests that deterrence won't work. It may be a dangerous country. It may have very dangerous leaders, but they're not suicidal. When they fought the Iran-Iraq war, they were careful in how they escalated. When we fought them at the end of the Iran-Iraq war in an undeclared naval war, they were careful how far to go. Iran may send young men to carry out suicide terrorist operations, but there's nothing that suggests the Iranian leadership wants to destroy their whole country. So yes, I think deterrence and containment is an option we should seriously look at if sanctions and diplomacy don't succeed in keeping Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. It's not the end of the world. It's not the apocalypse if Iran gets nuclear weapons. It's a bad thing, no doubt.
It's a management issue.
It's a bad management issue, but it is, again, a management issue. And we've experienced in how to manage this problem.
All right, very good. Well, we'll be back one more time with Bruce Riedel. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So in our last segment, let's step back a bit and put all of this in the context of the wider Middle Eastern / North African / Near Eastern security environment, and particularly want to ask you about American policy and how it has responded to the dynamic events in the region recently, including not only what we used to call the Arab Spring and what people now increasingly like to call the Arab Awakening. How is it going? Obama came into office 4 years ago genuinely wanting to improve relations with the Arab world, with the Muslim world, made a number of overtures, said he would sit down without precondition to speak with Iranian leaders. Very much an open approach. How's the scorecard look from your perspective?
I think we have to start by understanding the magnitude of what's going on. For the last half century, every country in the Arab world was a police state. In Arabic, they called mukhabarat states. Some were incredibly brutal, like Saddam's Iraq. Others are a little less brutal, but they're still police states, like Jordan, like Bahrain. A year and a half ago, the police state structure of the Middle East began to crumble, and a revolution of expectations finally erupted. We're only in the first couple of years of this process, and if the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution is any guide, we're only at the beginning of what's going to be a process that may take a decade or more to unfold. The United States was a partner with all of those police states, or at least many of them. We worked with many of them. We encouraged tight security procedures to go after terrorists like Al-Qaeda. Now we see all of this in transition. The challenge the United States and many of the rest of the world faces is that our hearts with the revolution. We want democracy, we want accountability, we want the rule of law. Our head is often, though, with the counter-revolution, with the House of Saud. After all, they're the world's gas station. We can't throw them under the bus that easily and not expect very serious complications. How do you manage being on the side of the revolution and being on the side of the counter-revolution at the same time? That's no easy task. I think President Obama so far has managed it reasonably well, but it often doesn't look very pretty because it isn't all that coherent in many ways. You're trying to manage a revolutionary process, and managing revolutionary process is very, very difficult to do. The dynamics of where this is going is not going to be made in Washington, it's not going to be made in Ottawa, it's not going to be made in Tel Aviv. It's going to be made in the Arab world and in the streets of the Arab world. We can influence the trajectory, but basically we're more observers than anything else. I think the president's got it about right, but he's going to have to continue to be nimble, and he's going to have to be willing to move with events.
And apart from Iran, what are the other countries that you would flag as pressing, looming security challenges that will require a lot of attention from American foreign policy?
Well, I think we ought to keep a very close eye on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not immune to the message of the Arab Spring. The Saudis know that. The House of Saud has spent $130 billion in the last 18 months trying to buy off potential unrest at home. That's a lot of money. They clearly recognize that Saudis may want a hand in governing their future, just like Egyptians, just like Syrians, just like Yemenis. Change in Saudi Arabia is the $64 million question. Can it be done in some kind of passive way, reformist way, or will it come like it has in Egypt, like it has in Libya, through violence, through revolution? Keep an eye on Saudi Arabia. That's the one that really matters the most for all of us, and it's not immune to the Arab Spring.
No, we've already seen some signs that Iran might not be immune to that either. There was the abortive Green Revolution, but the demographics show a youth bulge with increasing expectations, not necessarily wedded so emotionally to the revolution the way earlier generations of Iranian youth were at the time of the revolution. One school of thought is that Iran will solve the Iranian problem for us if we're patient and we don't rock the boat, that eventually there will be a transition to a kinder, gentler kind of regime. Do you subscribe to that view? And if you do, how patient do we have to be?
I do subscribe to it. In many ways, the Green movement can be seen as a harbinger of the Arab Spring. And while it was suppressed, and suppressed brutally, it is a reflection that there is a desire, a very significant desire in Iran for a different kind of future. Iranians want a government that's transparent, that lives up to the rule of law, that's accountable, just like everyone else wants to. The history of containment, we now have a pretty good dossier on. Patience will work. Change will come from within if you can keep repressive governments holed up and not let them use the outside world as an excuse for their continued repression at home. It took us 50 plus years, but George Kennan's argument that containment would ultimately produce change within the Soviet Union turned out to be right. And I think it will turn out to be right in Iran again in the future. It may not be a complete change. We may see a change in which you get a gentler version of the Islamic Republic. President Khatami, for example, represented that movement. But I think it'll come in time.
And a military strike by Israel and or the United States would likely delay that?
I think it would delay that. It might set it back for a decade or more. Iranians, like everyone else, are patriots. When they see their country under attack, they will rally behind the government. That's what happened in the Iran-Iraq War. In 1980, the revolution was very much still in doubt. Saddam's decision to invade Iran in September 1980 sealed the fate of the opponents of the Islamic Republic. Literally, many of them either went into exile or were executed because they were seen as traitors to their country.
Mm-hmm. well, a very complex situation in a complex part of the world. But thank you for coming in and helping us sort it out a bit. And
My pleasure.
Appreciate your insights. And for our audience, thank you for joining us. And please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. And look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency and an advisor to 4 different presidents. Noted expert, particularly on the Middle and the Near East. And Bruce, we're very happy to have you here. Very timely, your visit to Waterloo, because among the most pressing items in the headlines these days is Iran and the possibility that there may be a war between either Israel and Iran or Israel and the United States and Iran in the not too distant future. So appreciate having your insights on this, both your deep historical insights and your current insights. And perhaps you might start by giving us a sense of why it is that Iran is apparently in search of a nuclear capability and why it's so resistant to the global pressure to keep that under limits.
Certainly. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here today with you. Iran is a country that feels isolated, feels under siege. This is my guess, and this is just a guess, but it's based on a lot of time studying this Iranian revolutionary regime, is the degree of ambiguity is probably what they'd really like to have. The perception that they have a bomb in the basement without having actually tested it or taken the step of moving across the threshold. That's the kind of ambiguity about your nuclear program, which will tend to deter anyone from coming after you, but not necessarily get you into the jailhouse of having broken the non-proliferation regime and actually be a declared violator of international agreements. And in some ways, that's exactly the position the Iranians are moving themselves into. Everyone knows they're enriching more and more uranium. Everyone knows they have missiles which could be used to deliver a nuclear weapon. And at a certain point, everyone would agree, or most experts would agree, that in 5
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Bruce Riedel on the Iranian nuclear program. Hello and welcome to the initial installment of the 3rd season of the Inside the Issues video podcast series. I'm David Welch, your host, the Balsley School's Chair of Global Security and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I'm pleased to welcome here into the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation a noted expert on some aspect of international politics or global governance. And today, to kick off our next season, I'm very happy to welcome Bruce Riedel, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and for 30 years.
Or is if it has its own nuclear deterrent. They remember that their neighbor to the east, Afghanistan, and their neighbor to the west, Iraq, have both been invaded or liberated, depending upon your point of view, by the United States in the last decade. Neither of those wars would have happened had Iraq or Afghanistan had nuclear weapons, and that's a message, that's a lesson the Iranians unfortunately have drawn from recent history.
But Afghanistan was invaded because it was host to Al-Qaeda, and Iraq was invaded officially because it was seeking nuclear weapons. So Iran doesn't host Al-Qaeda.
Right.
In fact, Al-Qaeda is quite antagonistic to Iran.
Absolutely.
And if it's going to be invaded, it might be invaded precisely because it's seeking nuclear weapons. So if you're sitting in Tehran and you're trying to decide what serves my national security interests best, is it obvious that having a nuclear capability is a solution to a problem or a problem in and of itself?
A country which has been the target now, it's an open secret, of cyber warfare. Iranian nuclear scientists are being assassinated on the streets of Iran. There is a covert war going on between Iran, the United States, and Israel. Iran is responding. Many would argue Iran started the covert war back in 1979 when it took American diplomats hostage. The Iranians see themselves living in a very dangerous part of the world. They are surrounded on all corners by countries which they believe are hostile, and which many have nuclear weapons. Pakistan, India to the east, Russia to the north, Israel to the west, and America in the Persian Gulf to the south. Now, Iran has created many of these enemies, but the reality is, even if it's your fault that you created enemies, you have them. And Iranian national security leaders, I think, increasingly feel that the only way Iran will ever be secure